everyone, Kendra here with Divinely Driven Ministry, bringing you your mission-driven moment for the day. Did you know that as a believer of God, one who has faith to really believe everything that is in this, that God gives us that faith to believe if we ask for it, and that out of that belief comes our obedience, and that for those who really follow him, that there are promises for the believer. As I was reading Hebrews, it was a sweet reminder and a challenge as I read Paul challenging the Hebrews. In chapter 3, he warns them to be careful, that they would make sure that their hearts were not evil and unbelieving, which would turn them away from the living God. He warns them to warn each other so that none of them would be deceived by sin and that their hearts wouldn't harden against God. And he wrapped it up with encouraging them, for if they were faithful, if we are faithful to the end, trusting God just as firmly when we first believed, we will share in all that belongs to Christ. And it continues to say, remember what it says, today when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as Israel did when they rebelled. So he goes on to share about briefly how Israel disobeyed God, how they didn't have faith to believe and they didn't obey. And so they weren't able to enter into God's rest. And then in chapter 4, he says, but there is good news because God has prepared this rest and it has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listen to God, for only we who believe can enter his rest. As I was reading this, it was such a good reminder that the rest that God talks about for his believers that he promises to us isn't rest from work, isn't rest from the hard things in life, but that in the midst of hardness, in the midst of trouble, in the midst where we find ourselves weary and we might want to quit, God will give us rest. And he gives rest to his believers who have faith to believe in his word and who are living out what he has asked them to do. And so I hope you caught on to that. We get the rest when we are listening to Jesus, not when we aren't listening to him. We get the rest when we come to him and say, I can't do this on my own. Help me follow you. Give me faith to follow you. Help me be obedient to you. He is the perfect Father who wants to give his children what they need. He wants us to be less independent and more dependent upon him. So won't you turn to him today and ask him for that faith that leads to belief, that leads to obedience, where we can find rest in him.